This morning we're going to talk about boundaries, and a boundary is a real or understood line that marks a limit. You know, like the imaginary line that you drew in the back seat of the car down the middle, and you said, now your sister has that half of the back seat, and you have this half, and don't you cross over, or I'll pull this car over, so help me. And of course, they reached across the imaginary line, and you couldn't stop the car, you were in traffic. You remember those days. Since I'm already talking about kids, I will talk about the importance of imposing and enforcing boundaries on your children first. Later I'll talk about God's boundaries and the importance of setting boundaries for yourself, and then enforcing those boundaries when you're an adult. Boundaries. The name evokes feelings of security and ownership, especially if you're talking about the boundaries of your property. This is my apartment, or this is my house and lawn, or my farm, or my ranch. We need boundaries to define what is ours, to know the limits of what we own, to be able to restrict access to our property, and to know where the property of others begins and ours ends. The old saying that good fences makes good neighbors has a lot of truth to it. A fence marks off the boundary of your property and sets it off from your neighbor's. What is within that fence is yours, and by golly, that's a good feeling. It provides you also with privacy. You're essentially isolating yourself a little bit from the world. Boundaries are important, and they have been since biblical times. Back then, the boundaries of a field were defined by a pile of stones or a large stone at each corner of the property. It was considered a great offense to move one of those boundary stones on your neighbor's property in order to enlarge your field. God referred to this form of stealing when he spoke through his prophet Hosea.
Judea leaders are like those who move boundary stones. I will pour out my wreath on them like a flood of water.
And King Solomon wrote in the book of Proverbs,
do not move ancient boundary stones and encroach on the fields of the fatherless.
Moving a boundary stone was flat out stealing in a very underhanded way, especially if it was done to an orphan or to a widow. And this morning we're going to talk about behavioral boundaries, those set out by man and those set out by ourselves and those set out by God. Now, for those of you that were here last week and were not comatose by that part of my message, you may remember that I talked about the importance of setting boundaries for your children. A while back, a few years ago, I mentioned this experiment in the Tuesday Celebrate service. But back a few years ago, there was a psychological experiment done at an elementary school that just built this elementary school. And they did not put a fence around the playground. So on Monday, the first day of school, the bell rang and all the kids went to school. And the bell rang for recess. They all went outside, but they all stayed huddled up near the teacher. They were not comfortable not having a fence out there. And so for the rest of the week, they kind of did that. They stayed close in to the school building and to the teachers. Well, the weekend came and they built a fence all the way around the playground. On Monday morning, when the recess bell rang, the kids all went outside and scattered like quail to every corner of the playground. Excuse me. They were secure. They had boundaries that were set, and they would go right up to the fence even and play. They felt comfortable. I remember as a kid, my parents set out boundaries for us. Stay in the backyard was a common limit when we were little. Now, we had a high fence, and we would not dare go out of that gate because we knew if we went out the gate, we'd have trouble sitting down for a while. When we were older, the boundaries were moved to include both the front yard and the backyard. And we were told, don't leave the yard. And even though there was no fence in the front yard, we stayed inside the yard. We knew disobeying would bring unpleasant consequences. Our parents had set boundaries for us, and we were comfortable in them. Kind of made decision-making easy. When you were tempted to leave the yard, you know your parents had said no, so you didn't go. Children need boundaries. Children expect boundaries. They're comfortable and they're secure when they have reasonable boundaries set for them. Now, sure, they may fuss and they may whine and they may protest and roll around on the floor, But deep down, whether they realize it or not, they like to have limits set for them by their parents or their caregivers. It takes stress off of them by removing the decision-making process from them. Someone has made the decision for them. And believe me, it takes a lot of stress off the parents or the caregivers in the long run. Dealing with the protests of your children about the limits you have set for them is a lot less stressful than dealing with what can happen if you don't set limits for them. And as I said last week, your children don't need you as a friend, they need you as a parent. You need to be the parent. Now, too many parents are scared to set limits for their children or to discipline their children because they want to be popular with them. You can be friends with them after they're grown. Actually, you'll find that if you set boundaries for them when they were young, you'll be much closer to them, usually when they grow up. King Solomon said,
Train a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it.
And
discipline your son, for in that there is hope. Do not be willing party to his death.
let me see if this is. Okay. I'm sorry. That mic doesn't pick up from very far away, but it says, train a child in the way they should go and discipline them so you won't be a party to their death. In other words, by setting boundaries for your children and enforcing them, you may be actually doing something to one day save their life. Besides, you're helping them to be better persons and increasing their chances of a better and a happier future. Discipline them out of love and with love when they ignore the boundaries. Over the years, discipline has changed. My father disciplined with his belt, my mother with a crepe myrtle switch, and both were equally effective. But I've learned that you can discipline your children with a lot less physical punishment. When I was raising my children, I rarely spanked them, and it was only when they were outright defiant or telling a huge lie to me. I'm looking back, I'm sure now that I could have achieved equal or greater results by using other means. But I had my parents' discipline methods in the back of my mind, and even though I modified them, they were still there. Now, Dr. Freud would love that. Blame the parents. Our daughters didn't spank their children at all, unless there was real danger involved and they were defiant. And their children behaved beautifully. Talk about a guilt trip. Man, I have it seeing how good they turned out. But here's some rules when you discipline your children. Never discipline your children when you're angry or you're frustrated. Always be aware of your power and their fragility. Always be aware of the bond of love that exists between you and your child. So here's the deal. Set boundaries for your children out of love, just as God sets limits for us out of love. And realize first and foremost that children are just that. They're children. They don't reason or speak or behave like an adult because they can't. They're children. Hello? Don't be frustrated by this, but use this knowledge to help you see the big picture, to better understand them, to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and then be patient with them. It will be helpful if you remember the words of the Apostle Paul on this subject.
When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me.
One day your children will talk and will reason and will think like an adult when they actually are one. Until then, always keep in mind that they are children and they can't possibly think or reason like you. And contrary to what you may think, you young mommies, a baby doesn't cry just to irritate you. A baby cries for a specific need. That knowledge can be comforting to a stressed out parent. And sometimes one of the hardest parts of disciplining your children is to keep from laughing out loud at the ridiculous thing they've done or the ridiculous lie that they've told you. And laughing inside helps you to temper your discipline. So set limits that are reasonable and prudent, and then be a little flexible, and little is the operative word. Don't set ultra-strict limits or loose, ambiguous limits. Remember, children look to you for guidance, protection, love, and for their limits. Be loving, firm, and for goodness sakes, be the adult. There is one caveat here. You must be the kind of parents or grandparents or caregivers that have set boundaries of your own. And while it's easy and convenient to say to them, do as I do, don't do as I'm doing, children easily see through this. Don't give them the excuse of doing bad things because they see you doing them. And for those of you who thought this message wasn't going to touch you, surprise. If you were fortunate enough to have been raised by someone who really loved you and who set reasonable limits for you, who provided guidelines for you, they made it easy. You had your limits defined for you, and you knew that there were consequences if you went beyond those boundaries. But once you left home and ventured out into the big wide world on your own, you no longer had someone looking over your shoulder and setting limits for you, except for the legal boundaries established by the laws of the land. Happens especially if you go off to college. You are now considered an adult, and any boundary setting had to come from you. Freedom can be intoxicating, and some young adults go a little wild when they go out on their own, especially if they were raised with very strict boundaries or without any reasonable boundaries. Once you set boundaries for yourself, you'll find that you tend to keep raising the bar for yourself. Once you conquer the big areas in your life that need to be changed, you'll begin to focus on other areas, or at least you should be. And as you progress in this Christian walk of life, you'll find that it's not a chore to do it, to constantly try to improve. Instead, you'll find that it's very satisfying and rewarding, and it's a challenge. And believe me, we all need challenges in our life to keep things exciting. Your new boundaries that you set on higher standards will make you eventually move up to a new higher standard, and the chain reaction continues. Part of the whole concept of being a Christian is that you set these boundaries for yourself. It's called free will. When Christ was on earth, he didn't go around trying to convince lawmakers to enact laws to make you do moral and ethical things. Instead, he said it's up to each individual to establish the boundaries that God has told them that they should have. The Jews already had over 400 laws on the books, governing everything, even how far you could walk on a Sabbath. Christ did not want mankind to think that all they had to do to please God was to obey every law. Many Jews felt that even though they were mean and stingy and selfish and unethical, they could still get to heaven if they obeyed the law. It's kind of like today. Just because you aren't breaking a civil or a criminal law doesn't mean that you're a nice person, or that you have integrity or honesty or high morals, or that you're going to heaven. God lets us make the choice. Again, it's the double-edged sword of free will. Like our parents told us as children, he has told us what boundaries that we should have. But unlike our parents, he leaves it up to us to obey. Now, our parents' punishment was swift and sure. God's punishment is sure, but it is often only after we have passed from this world that we receive it, and then it's too late. It's like the fence in this next picture. It's there as a recognizable boundary, but you can climb over it or you can climb through it. The choice is up to you. It's free will. Make choosing an easy answer. Remember that no is a complete sentence. Making up your mind to say no to bad choices takes the stress and pressure off your decision making. Remember back when you were young and just starting out and had no money, and when it came to buying things, the answer was easy. The decision making process was easy. No, you didn't have money for it. So once you make up your mind, it takes pressure off. If you're truly a Christian, you should love God with all your heart. And if you truly love him that way, you realize that you need to establish your boundaries along the boundary lines that Christ gave each of us. Jesus said, if anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and he will come to him and make our home with him. He who does not love me will not obey my teaching. So this week, if you haven't already done so in your life, start setting your own boundaries and then commit to staying within those boundaries. Commit. That's the key. Until you are truly committed, you or someone else can easily move your boundary stones. Remember those school kids before they had the fence and then after they had the fence. Make your boundaries permanent. Make them a part of you. And like those children, you'll feel safe and secure, and you'll feel that way for the rest of your life. May God bless this message to each of you.